And so the question is, how did Ruth maneuver the space around her? How did she take advantage of the opportunities presented to her, right? So we've established her as this woman who is extraordinary simply as a widow who's running this business and negotiating with predominantly foreign men. And so this is her in her later years. And the picture is not so clear, but I have to say, I love this picture of her on her veranda. And in thinking about how she negotiated the world around her, she was very regal, right? It was known that when she was going to go out, even though she lived very close, she didn't live in the northern. She had her own house, but even though, she would go to work every day after breakfast, she would always wear her hat. She was fully outfitted, even for that like 1.5 block walk. She was going out, and that everyone around her, my mother always said, every single person who saw her on the street stopped and greeted her, but also the men tipped their hat at her, right? It was very much like they understood she was royalty in many ways, right? And in her church, because she was so influential in the church, they called her Sister Ruth. So people would step aside on the sidewalk, tip their hat, Sister Ruth, how are you, Sister Ruth? And it was just this sense of, you someone who has power, but you're also someone so gracious, right? She was known in the community for actually giving so much, particularly because she had a lot of money. And why, one of the things I find extraordinary is that as a widow, she built herself a huge 4-bedroom house. So I showed you the house where she started with her husband and 7 children. That house eventually she would give to my grandmother, who had 4 daughters, including my mother, and that's where they lived. That's where my mother and her sisters lived, right, with my grandfather and grandmother. But what I've come to find out is that my great grandmother Ruth had multiple properties. And for her children, what she did was she had these houses built all over Limon and put her children and then her grandchildren eventually in these houses. No one was in debt. She had that much wealth because she was making dollars through the Northern. And so, as this widow, she built this huge house for herself that became sort of the center of cultural life and activity. So, in about 1943, 1944, so we're talking about the end of World War II, she was able to build this house for herself, and she lived there until her death in May 1967 when she died at the age of 76. So this is a picture of her on one of the verandas of her house. She was someone who was known for her plants. And one of the things that her house boasted of was indoor plumbing. So imagine in the 1940s, when everybody had an outhouse, or you went outside and it was external from the house. She had indoor plumbing and had a massive tub for beautiful baths. And she had a piano. She had a piano in this house. And so it became a space where she could invite local Black families. And her daughter Beatrice was well-known piano player. And she would play the piano and she would host these parties. And it was beautiful. It was, the community came together, they socialized. Of course, there was a space for always for the church space. But I'm saying this was a secular space where she invited certain Black families to come and be in her home. And she was a very famous and fabulous cook. She knew how to cook very well. And so she was able to entertain, and that house became a space of culture and community. Okay, and I guess one of the interesting things and why I know so much about Ruth is because my mother, I will say this, was her favorite grandchild. And my mother was actually raised by her grandmother between the ages of 6 and 10. And she lived in that new house. So when that house was built, my mother didn't go to the house, the first house where her mother and her three sisters and her dad lived, but she moved with her grandmother into that new big house and had a space for herself. And my great grandmother Ruth was very much focused on legacy and education, and particularly for the women in our family. And particularly for my mother, she asked her, "What do you want to do?" And when my mother said, "I want to teach," she said, "You'll never have to worry about it. I will take care of your education." And she did that. She made that commitment all the way through until her death in 1967. My mother's education through university was taken care of, and my mother had a fantastic career as a Spanish professor for over 30 years. And that is based on the educational foundation that her grandmother Ruth provided for her. One of the other things, and I showed the passport photos before, is that Ruth traveled, right? So that not only was she extraordinary because she was this widow who was running these quarters, but she also got on ships, right? She went to New York. Sometimes she'd go to a fancy hotel in San Jose simply because she could. Right. And so it wasn't as if she was just in the life of her work and her family, but she was someone who also ventured into the world because she felt she could. She had the money to do it. She also had networks of family and friends who lived in San Jose. She also had networks of people who were also in the US. And so these ventures allowed her to be this global person, and she was incredibly respected. She was also someone who she financially supported many different projects in Limon also at that time period because she had the money in which to do so. She was very, very generous. Beyond her 7 children and their families, she was also someone who contributed very intentionally into the community, specifically around her church. So this is a picture of my mother. She's on the second left, and her sisters. So we start with Marjorie, who is now deceased, and then my mother Norma, and then Jean, and then Sylvia. So Sylvia is the eldest, Norma's second, Marjorie's third, and Jean is fourth. And this is a picture of them in San Jose in 1961. And it's one of my favorite pictures of my mother. And so my mother Norma and my tia Jean and tia Sylvia live in the United States. And they're one of the only ones outside of a cousin who actually left Limon and Costa Rica and came to the States and started family. Pretty much everybody else remained in Costa Rica. This is a picture of the Baptist Church. It's an older picture. It still exists now. It was established in 1888. This is the First Baptist Church of Limon, and my great grandmother Ruth was a deacon. She was an elder who assisted with the annual baptisms on Good Friday. She was a member of the women's group. And I think particularly one of the things that defines Ruth as not only a savvy businesswoman, a property owner, and a family, sort of the matriarch of the family, is that her spirituality and her faith was central to her identity. She was a devoted Christian, and I think she led by example. So she was integral to the church, whether she was singing in the choir or her children were helping with Sunday school. But the point is that her church life was a central part of her identity. And that is very clearly part of the legacy, I think, when we look at the family today in Costa Rica. I would say the thing that defines my family beyond its, sort of education and intellect and progress is the fact that at the core, it's a deeply devoted Christian family.
Somos voces de la historia, sangre, tinta y papel. Somos voces de la historia, mis ancestros, su saber, mis ancestros, su saber, mis ancestros, su saber.